I'm actually on time for live. It's just, wow. Oh, we're live. Right.
Just share the live stream about quickly. I'll be with you in a second.
You're fine. I am having a look for the live. There we go. Let's have a look at the. We've got 3 viewers on. So we're on Facebook and YouTube, which is very exciting. We have the technology. Considering how many lives I've tried to do and it's gone terribly wrong. So I'm actually very proud of the fact that we're even online. So say hello if you're there. Oh, hi, Naomi. Oh, yeah, we're on YouTube as well. Look at that. Good job. Hi, Lisa. I've put closed captioning on. It's always fun to see what it comes up with, actually. And you're on there. So should we just let a couple more people join us? If you are listening, can you just let us know that you can hear us? Because I realise I've got everything on mute. Hi, Lisa. How are you doing? Can you hear us? I'm sure you can, because obviously I've worked on the technology, so it's all sorted. Okay. Right, ready? So thank you for joining us this evening. And we have Carly, who's one of our trustees from All Education and Koala. And we also have David Gray-Hammond. We're very excited to chat to you today, David, and hear all about your book, which is, I've put in the Facebook event. So you've got a link to it on Amazon to buy it. And I will also put links on everywhere. Perfect, everyone can hear. Put links everywhere else so that people can get the book, and we will get one for the hub as well. So shall I let you introduce yourself, David, and tell us a bit about you?
Yeah, so I'm David Gray-Hammond. I'm the author of The New Normal: Autistic Musings on the Threat of a Broken Society. I run the blog Emergent Divergence. I also own DGH Neurodivergent Consultancy. And I'm a regular educator, learner at Or Academy. I do a lot of their live streams. I'm also their co-host of their podcast, Especially Interesting. I do a lot of other things as well, but it would be here all day if I keep listing everything I do.
That's awesome. I think going back to your just sort of to dive in, I think going back to your Academy lives, that was where, just going straight in on it, we talked about earlier about the fact that I understood psychosis through listening and watching you and watching the lives, and actually it got me involved, and I listened to a couple of lives, like the older ones, and just about mental health in general, because obviously, you know, we do experience poor mental health differently from neurotypical people, and it was just really interesting to be able to relate to something. So obviously it's like, I don't know about you and Carly, but from my experience as a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD, I find that it's not till someone says something, I think, oh, that's a thing, is it? That is what it's that. Okay, that's great. And, you know, it's within speaking to people that you sort of understand your own experience, really.
Yeah, I mean, so the easiest way of explaining it is, obviously I'm autistic and ADHD, but simply put, I'm also schizophrenic. But more complicated than that is actually my formal diagnosis is something along the lines of other psychotic disorder not of non-organic origin, or something I can never remember the full title. Wow. Okay. Basically, it's the PDD-NOS of the schizophrenia spectrum. Okay. So they wouldn't give me the full schizophrenia diagnosis because I was atypical, and I always argue that, well, of course I was atypical. I'm autistic. Yeah. So, you know, I experience auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, tactile hallucinations. In fact, if I have a sense I seem to be able to hallucinate in that sense.
Wow.
And I also experience delusions, typically paranoid, persecutory delusions. And it's when it starts to happen is usually when I know I've been overdoing things, because I often talk about the burnout to psychosis cycle that I've experienced, where you become burnt out, and then you start to try and hyper focus on something, because that's what an autistic person's brain wants to do. You hyper focus on the wrong thing, spiral into it, and all of a sudden you're having a psychotic episode. And it turns out quite a few people seem to relate to that. So
absolutely, and that's what I related to. And I think the whole, for me, it's and we've got so many people in our community who struggle with that. And I think it's trying to move away from the neurotypical. It's not neurotypical, is it? That's what we talked about this online recently, didn't we? About the fact that do neurotypical people experience schizophrenia or psychosis? Maybe not. Maybe they're already neurodivergent and actually haven't been diagnosed with other stuff. But for me, that's what I got out of it is, you know, I know if I'm burning out and going into crisis, I'll start to experience a psychosis. And I think a few months ago, it was seeing people in the corner of my eye who weren't there. That was the seemed to be another pattern with me. So I'm like, I need to stop. I need to slow down, or I'm going to burn out completely. So it's really useful to know that and to normalize it, isn't it?
And the other thing that I think is important to note is I may be schizophrenic, but I don't actually view it as an illness per se. For me, it's another branch of my neurodivergence. It can cause me to suffer. I do take medication for it in the same way an ADHD might take Ritalin for their ADHD. I take olanzapine for my schizophrenia. But for me, I view all of it as I have a neurodivergent brain. It works differently. I experience the world differently. And actually, even some of the worst experiences that come from being schizophrenic, if I learn a lot from them, because it teaches me where I need to have better boundaries, where I need to have better control of my environment.
Yeah, and when you understand that, it's like a strategy, isn't it? It's just seeing the bit, because I don't know about you, but as a learner, and I don't know if Carly's the same, but I find that I'll often say to someone, what does it look like when this happens? And when you experience that, you can actually kind of tag a tangible experience onto something. It makes it much easier to relate to. And I know Carly will have something to say about this, but just chatting about some of the things that, you know, with the psychosis and the delusions and stuff like that, is that then links us into women, doesn't it? And how women get misdiagnosed with BPD and stuff, because it's the whole paranoia, you know. And I find it really interesting. There's just so much, there's quite a lot to unpick. And I'm sure you've been doing a lot of that in your book, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so I do a lot about the sort of depathologizing of mental health in that book. Because I do strongly believe that we need to move away from these medical models of the way people's brains work. I don't believe we should be pathologizing brains that work outside of this weird category of what we consider normal. I go a lot in my book into sort of neuronormativity and these normative attitudes, that there is a standard way of existing and expressing yourself. And I sort of view medicalization of mental health and all neurodivergence, really, the medicalization of it really serves no purpose other than to enforce normative attitudes.
Absolutely. Carly, you've got to have something to add to
that. Yeah, in terms of the females being misdiagnosed, the amount of people that I've spoken to who have been diagnosed with bipolar or BPD or such like, and then gone on to discover actually they're autistic. And when I was assessed for autism, they assessed me for bipolar at the same time, because of how similar females on the spectrum and bipolar can look like. And it's really dangerous when I hear people saying that they've been given antipsychotics when they don't need them because they've been misdiagnosed.
And also, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And I think something to ask both of you then, I guess, is when you, like, I experience psychosis, but I don't need antipsychotics. I know that I need to change my routine. I need to get out of burnout. But obviously, David, for you, it's been really helpful. So, you know, obviously, we're not medically trained, but for yourself, David, what would you say were things that, or flags that for you would make you think you probably need to go and get this looked at, as opposed to it's probably a psychosis thing? And I know we don't want to sort of, you know, be giving medical advice, but I think it's just interesting to understand people's experiences. I
mean, for me, warnings, the warning signs that things aren't doing well with my psychological well-being, I have to be creative with how I notice them, because the nature of experiencing paranoid delusions is that you don't know it's happening.
Exactly, yeah.
So I have to look for things like, historically, I've been a cigarette smoker. I quit years ago. If I start smoking again, it usually means my mental health is declining. I'm in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. If I start finding myself craving sort of alcohol, I don't really tend to crave the drug use anymore, but still, when I'm struggling, my brain will be going, have a drink, have a drink, have a drink, have a drink. And so if I've got sort of that sort of thinking coupled with the cigarette smoking, I have to stop and think, well, actually, something's really not right here. I also have to trust the people around me. Because and this is a privilege for me, that I can trust the people around me, my mother, the mother of my child, because they can say to me, David, you know, you're being very paranoid. The things you're talking about, you know, that they're not making any sense to us. But fundamentally, I have to just rely on other people to notice if I'm becoming delusional. Now, in terms of hallucinations, there is one thing that I hallucinate that always flags up to me that something's gone really wrong, which is I have the same hallucination every time, and it usually means I'm already quite deep into an episode. I hallucinate a woman in a black dress whose face I can never see. She's not threatening, but she's always there when I'm feeling lonely or sad, and she'll just appear. And you know, I've drawn pictures of her and all sorts, but I know when I see that particular hallucination, that's when I can go, wait a minute, that's a hallucination and something's not right here.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And I reckon there's so many people. I was going to say, if you're watching and you want to ask questions, please just pop them in the chat in YouTube and Facebook, and we can answer them. I think it's really fascinating, isn't it? Okay, so that kind of leads on to things like alexithymia, if I pronounce it properly, because I find that I won't know intrinsically if I'm struggling with something, and it will be something externally, like you've just mentioned, that will flag something for me, as opposed to me knowing inwardly that there is something wrong. So that's really, and I know that there'll be loads of people that will relate to this and the stuff that you're sharing. So obviously this is something you talk about a lot. And when you were talking about sort of recovering from addiction, that's something that we so often hear in the hub when we're meeting other adults and, you know, young adults, that they've been through this journey of self-medication. And it just seems I suppose when you're so far into your journey, you look at it and you think it's really obvious what's happening here. But when you're that person who's in that journey, it's not easy to see, is it? And we've all, I don't know about you, Carly, but I know I've definitely, you know, drink was my thing really, and it wasn't until I had children and I couldn't drink anymore, because you can't get out with a hangover, because it's really hard when you've got young children. And I was like, hang on, I've lost my coping strategy here. You know, and you just can't, or, you know, staying in bed for the whole weekend after going out for the weekend. I thought I was really gregarious. I was always out partying. I thought, there's no way I'm autistic. What a ridiculous thing to say, because I went for an ADHD assessment and then got told I was autistic, which I was very cross at the time. So I was like, that's ridiculous. I know I was autistic. And then I was like, oh, hang on, there's a lot of stuff adding up here. So it's fascinating, isn't it? How a lot of us just, I don't know about you, but I have a very bad self-awareness kind of, and I don't have a lot of it a lot of the time. So
being alexithymic as part of my autistic profile meant that it took me a long time to realize not only that I was experiencing distress from psychotic symptoms or traits or whatever you want to call them, but it also took me a very long time to realize that my alcohol and drug use was out of control, because I couldn't read the internal signals in my body that was saying you need to have more, you need to have more, you need to have more. So I would act on those feelings without actually knowing I was feeling them. So I just convinced myself, well, this is just a lifestyle choice. But actually, I was, you know, it got to the point where I was drinking a bottle of Oromorph in the morning for breakfast and taking a handful of diazepam.
Wow.
And you know, it was really out of control. And it was only when I started to suffer these really severe consequences for my health, and I still couldn't stop. And at first I couldn't understand why I couldn't stop, because I didn't feel like I was addicted. But then I realized that actually without those things, I felt like I was drowning. And it was really vital for me to have that moment of realizing, because it gave me, I think one of the advantages of being autistic was once I decided I was going to do something, I did it. And I woke up in hospital one day and I just thought, if I don't stop, I'm not going to make it. So I went and got checked into a detox ward.
Wow. It is interesting, isn't it? It does seem to be one of those things of being, you know, autistic, is once you actually intrinsically make a decision, it just happens. And it's weird, isn't it? And yet sometimes we can't even make dinner. In fact, a lot of the time I can't make dinner. And yet there's really
I'll avoid ringing the bank or I don't know, making lunch or washing the dishes. But, you know, my brain thought nothing of going, yep, we're going to stop being addicted to drugs now. You know, and I just sort of did that. And obviously I'll never stop being an addict, but it's like my brain decided that I was going into sobriety, and here I am today. That's not to say that it can never come back. You have to be aware of the fact that there is always that chance of relapse, and it is work every single day to make sure you don't go back. But
so Becky has just said alexithymic to ex-addict, ex-drinker, ex-bipolar. Yeah, right. So and then BPD diagnosis. It's like this is a personal intervention, and that's the thing. There's so many people can relate to this. Naomi said she was diagnosed with BPD and given antipsychotics from 17. And it's
actually note that I was also diagnosed with BPD before I was diagnosed autistic.
It's crazy. It's just, and I don't know. I mean, it's controversial, but I don't know. I think it's a tricky one. I better not say it live. But yeah, the BPD thing, honestly, we have so many adults come into group, and some of the volunteers look at each other and they say, yeah, I've got BPD, but I really struggle with social anxiety. So I've come here and we look at each other and we're like, okay, we'll let you discover this yourself. Because, you know, we can't have people come in and say, you're autistic, much as we want to, because obviously we can't, you know, diagnose. But I think the more that people share, and people like yourself share these experiences, you know, it's that whole light bulb moment when suddenly everything seems to make sense because you're relating to someone's experience. You're just like, wow, this is crazy. This is actually everything that I've been through. This all makes sense to me.
The truth is that there's very few, if any, autistic people that haven't experienced some kind of trauma. And when you think about trauma in an autistic context, you've got to drop those neurotypical assumptions about what is and isn't traumatic. And there is a reason why so many of us get misdiagnosed as BPD, but I'm not sure people are ready to hear it just yet.
Go on. I've got a feeling we might be on the same wavelength, so I'll let you say it out loud, so I'm not going to.
It's not that BPD doesn't exist. I just think perhaps it's a label that's used to discuss a particular subset of autistic people rather than just cut to the chase and tell them they're autistic.
It's exactly what we've always said, yeah.
I have nothing to back that up, so feel free to take that with as much of a pinch of salt as you can. But I do a lot of mentoring work, I do a lot of consultancy work, and I've not met a person diagnosed with BPD yet who wasn't also obviously autistic.
Yeah, but if you look at the criteria, black and white thinking, struggling with relationships, you think, wow, you know, and I agree. This
is where we get into that thing of, you know, psychiatry has these neat little diagnostic boxes, but what they don't tell you is these neat little diagnostic boxes are all layered over each other. You know,
absolutely.
What fits into one box might also fit into another 10 boxes, and diagnoses are not these clear boundaries in psychiatry, and it's a problem because I mean, I think it's a problem that's arisen from the pathologization of thinking differently and expressing differently, because it makes it easier to tell us we are broken if they can put a label to it. And the fundamental thing is that, okay, yeah, the way your mind works could be causing you an awful lot of suffering, but it doesn't mean you're a broken person. It probably means, in my experience, that the environment you're in is not well suited to your needs or is actively mistreating you.
I can't remember if it's Luke Bearden or if it's
Luke Bearden.
It is Luke, yeah.
Environment equals outcome.
I love it, and that is literally, that is one of our things we always quote now. We just say, you know, it's so hard when I speak to parents, and I know there's parents watching this tonight, and you know, they say to me, well, CAMHS aren't getting back to me, but what do you want from CAMHS? And they're like, well, I don't know, I just want stuff to go away and be okay. But you can't therapize your child into the wrong environment. So, you know, you've got to look at what's cool. And it's so difficult because everyone so many parents hang on that CAMHS thing. And having spoken to psychologists at CAMHS, they said, we're just not set up for this. We were set up like 20 years ago before we knew all this stuff.
A good quote is by Dr. Nick Walker, and the saying goes, you can't unqueer a queer mind. Basically, you can't take an autistic person and remove the autism, because autism itself doesn't actually exist. It's an abstract concept. It's not a separate entity. All that actually exists is autistic people. So I'm David, I'm autistic. If you took the autistic out of me, you'd also be taking the David out of me.
100%.
Because the two are the same thing. And any attempt to take the autistic out of me would actually just cause further neurodivergence through trauma.
Yeah. I think there's a few people sort of sharing. So Adele said that being misdiagnosed like many autistic people, but I have the opposite experience of being ignored and not being given help, and the ever-ending cycle of CBT and circle. And I know you know, Carly has views on this as well, but that's something that we often say to our adults, like, if you're being offered CBT, you be really careful, because we've seen it break people. You know, actually it destroys. It doesn't even not do anything. It's destructive.
It's very hit and miss. For me, it was moderately helpful with some of the things that I experienced. But the problem is CBT was designed around neurotypical minds, or people who sort of fit into that performance of neurotypicality. It was never looked at in the context of autistic people and otherwise neurodivergent people. So the NICE guidelines, the Institute for Clinical Excellence, they have this very useful bit where they go, if you're dealing with an autistic client in CBT, make sure you individualize the therapy. Well, that's great. Could you tell them how to individualize it? But they don't. So what you actually get is you get a CBT practitioner who comes to the autistic person and goes, everything you're thinking is wrong. And the autistic person goes, you don't even know how my brain's working right now. And everything you're telling me my brain is doing is the exact opposite of what it's doing. And that's what I've come across, is the number of autistic people who go, they told me how they thought my mind was working, and that was not how it was working at all.
And then some people obviously can't explain how their brain is working. So, you know, how are you feeling? How are you doing? I don't know, what do you mean, how am I feeling? I'm feeling a bit fizzy today. And they're like, what is that? And I think CBT as well is like you say, a lot of the basis of it, and again, I'm not a therapist, but is around the, you know, the stop thinking this thing. Like, my brain doesn't work like that. And it's not actually, so we do have the neurodivergent book of DBT skills, and we're starting to sort of use that as a community. And actually, we're very lucky locally that our our PCN, our primary care network, are working with us to neurodivergent some of their the stuff they offer, which is really good, and that's really promising. You know, that some medical practitioners are. We've got some more stuff here. Oh yeah, so someone says here, I ended up in a psych ward because I was found incompetent to stand trial. The psychiatrist who evaluated me for the court said that I understood sarcasm, so it had to be BPD instead. I mean, what? I'm sorry you had that experience. That is just
that's okay. I'm just going to say that's ridiculous. Like, I know lots of autistic people who are better at sarcasm than some of the neurotypical people I know.
Do you, David? Do you? There you go. That's as good as I can do. So.
Unfortunately, I'm not one of them, unless it is overt sarcasm.
Yeah, I'm not
I
great
don't
at
tend
it.
to get it. I'm very good at using sarcasm, but when people use it to me, my brain just goes, they're being sincere. But I know I can think of one person in particular who is so obviously autistic, and they're diagnosed, in fact. But their entire communication with people is sarcasm. It's just how they communicate. So to deny someone a diagnosis on the basis that they understood sarcasm, that's like saying, well, this child can't be autistic because they made eye contact. Like, do you know what? It looks like I'm making eye contact most of the time, but actually I'm staring at this bit between your eyes.
Yeah,
It's a very clever way of pretending to make eye contact.
well, my son stares at people as well, like just like this, you know, and will not break that gaze. I'm like, wow, and he's diagnosed. And I think, Carly, I'm going to let you say, because I've just been talking and talking, and I'll go to the comments and have a look and see what's going on in here.
Yeah, interestingly, I'm very good at being sarcastic, but I'm not very good at understanding sarcasm.
Yeah.
I don't know how.
You're very dry, Carly. Your sense of humour is very dry as well, isn't it? So
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely got a first class ticket to hell, that's for sure. But yeah, I haven't experienced psychosis. But listening to everybody's stories, you know, I think we need to speak about it more so that people can get the support that they need. Yeah, and where I live, services are shocking, CAMs are shocking, but it's not always their fault, you know. It's stretched, it's money, there's no, you know, there's just no money to plow into it. But yeah, just trying to think.
I've got a question. So I mentioned here, so Jojo said, could you understand seeing moving figures and paranoia when for me it's driving, thinking something is wrong and overthinking every minor detail? Welcome to being autistic. Also, day-to-day activities are hard, can go from active to passing out in minutes. I'm given so many meds, I don't know where my own head is. That sounds really tricky. Sleep, concentration, sensory overload, all PTSD, depression, anxiety. Oh, I'm really sorry that, yeah, you've had to experience a partner suicide. That's awful, Jojo. That's, you know, that's a really, really tricky thing to have gone through. And it sounds like, yeah, and that's, you know, the over medication of autistic people. And I mean, there's even, I don't know everything about it, there's an NHS campaign, isn't there, about not over, and I'm sure you've been involved in that, David, some way, about not over medicating autistic people.
Been involved in a few things, but yeah, there is a problem in psychiatry with over medicating people. That's not to say that medication isn't important. For me, you know, it stops me from having to spend my entire life in an institution, because that's where I would be without the medication I take. But the problem is that especially when you go to a GP, before they will refer you to anyone with any actual expertise in mental health, they will throw every medication that they're allowed to at you, and then some, before you actually get to see like a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It's tricky, because what I have found, talking about autistic people and psychosis, is that one of the most effective things that I have found when I'm mentoring autistic people is that if they have sort of psychotic experiences, obviously I'm not a therapist or a clinician, I'm a mentor. So what I do is I mentor them through understanding their autistic self, learning what their needs are, what their strengths and struggles are. And through that, I try to empower them to set boundaries in their life and curate their environment to fit them better. And I find if they're able to do that, a lot of the distressing traits they experience tend to reduce, because it's like we said earlier, autism plus environment equals outcome. So when an autistic person has boundaries that not only they honor, but other people honor, and is in an environment that is better suited to their needs, they tend to have those more positive outcomes in life.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's, you know, I've known some autistic people who've been through trauma that most average people would struggle to come to the other side of. And then it's just strange, you know, sometimes we appear to not be able to cope with the fact that, you know, we can't make our own dinner, and then deal with trauma that's just of such a massive league. You just think, I don't know how you've actually dealt with that. Becky's asked, What are your thoughts on EMDR?
Okay, so EMDR is like a gold standard therapy especially for PTSD.
Yeah.
I've heard some people have really good experiences with it, but without going into too much detail, I know of someone who had EMDR and it was done wrong.
Right, okay.
And it made them a lot worse, because what they actually did was cause the person to relive the trauma vividly, then go on leave for 2 weeks, and then say, well, actually, you're too traumatized now to do the therapy. So
wow.
From what I've never experienced it myself, but from what I've heard, when it's done well, fantastic. But you need to be able to trust that the therapist who is conducting the EMDR knows what they are doing, because it does involve a process of vividly walking through those traumatic memories.
It's really interesting. I think because we're trying to fight for more access to EMDR in our community, because we know it can be great. And I've seen autistic people literally turn around because the trauma they've dealt with is it kind of helps them process it. And I think, I don't know if it's just an autistic thing, but I think, so Jojo says EMDR is great, but it needs to be closed properly. And we've talked about this in group, actually, about how even with like DBT, if you're having some sort of therapy that's triggering something, the therapist has to help you sit with that and process that before they let you, it seems like common sense. It just seems quite, and we have it in groups. If we start to talk about something that's quite deep, we make sure that people are feeling okay before they leave, because it can't just trigger those emotions and then, just leave the people to deal with it. So what's EFT, Carly?
Tapping. So you follow the therapists, and you follow what they're doing, all the tapping movements, and you're talking at the same time, and you repeat what the therapist says. And honestly, I felt so good afterwards. It's really good, really good.
I think because it follows a similar sort of mechanism to EMDR, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, it does, yeah.
And repetitive movements, is if an autistic person's going to get something out of that.
Well, actually, the therapist who did it on me is autistic, so
right. And that's really interesting, actually, thinking about autistic therapists, because I had an autistic hypnotherapist, and I still think that 3 years ago she saved my life. I am 100% no, I was in such a bad place, and she absolutely helped me through a really tricky time. And for me, hypnotherapy was awesome, but it might not work for other people. I suppose it's about finding what's right. But again, I was lucky at that time I could afford to pay for it, because this stuff's just not accessible to so many people. Oh, Jojo does tapping weekly. It does help. That's good. And so Adele said, for me, a problem I have with accessing help with psychosis is being told I have too much insight, which seems to be a common experience. That's really interesting, Adele. And I know Dad and I have talked about this. So
I have been told it's taken me 14 years to get a diagnosis because I have too much insight. That's the exact words they used.
And it's not insight, it's knowledge. Different things, right?
Like what they seem to forget is I'm an autistic person who learned to analyze everything he did and work out why he did everything he did, so that he could better put out the person that he thought would be safest in an environment that wasn't suited to him. I was then a drug and alcohol addict who went on a journey of attaining sobriety and had to delve deep into himself to consider, why am I drinking? Why am I using drugs? What are the experiences that drive me to that? So that's just what I do. I use insight on myself constantly. It's an innate ability of mine, and I do believe it's because I'm autistic. But because I had that insight, they were going, well, you can't be schizophrenic, you can't be psychosis. It was only actually recently when I got a new psychiatrist, they took one look and went, why have you been diagnosed with a psychotic disorder? I went, your guess is as good as mine. You've got a psychotic disorder. I was like, thank you. It's only taken 14 years for someone to say that. But I would know that the average wait time for a schizophrenia diagnosis in this country is around about a decade.
Wow. I think it's something as well that we're, trying to do through the hub, is just to make sure that we're able to advocate for some of our adults. Because I do believe that the minute you have someone sitting in your corner, it just seems to change things, like who can talk sort of confidently about this stuff. But yeah, and Adele said, yeah, again, they have knowledge, they have no insight. It's just weird, isn't it? It's like, you know, I know everything there is to know about certain subjects, but it doesn't mean I can analyze a person in front of me. But that's an autistic thing, because I'm looking at the patterns. I can see a problem, problem in front of me, but to turn that on myself, that's too abstract, because I can't watch myself, right? I can't actually view and what's the word, observe my behaviors, because they're in me. So, and I think that might be, I don't know if that's some of it, I don't know.
Spend a lot of time actually reflecting on myself, but at the time I may not consider why I'm behaving in a certain way, but later on I will usually take time to reflect on how I've behaved and consider why I behave that way. But this whole problem with people not being able to get diagnosis or get support, this is why I took the time to qualify as an independent mental health advocate, because autistic people, if we need advocacy, almost inevitably end up with someone who does not understand autistic people. And I thought, you know what, even if I'm the only one out there, at least there's one person who gets the whole autistic thing and can advocate from a mental health act perspective. Yeah,
and that's really important, because that's the thing. I'm going to talk to you about that after, David. But that's really interesting, because I think it's just having the confidence to stand in front of a professional. You know, I've been into CAMHS meetings with parents and, you know, been told and gaslighted myself, and I'm like, I'm not doing this. This isn't my child. Stop, behave yourself. And then I've been, you know, worked with some of our professionals locally who are just phenomenal, and they'll just say, you know, they'll listen, you know, they listen to our experience and don't just assume that they know. You know, I'm also doing a lot of work with people with learning disabilities, and it's so similar. They just infantilize people and just think, you know, I find it so frustrating, you know. And then we could go on a massive rant about this, but, you know, people who are non-speaking, assuming that people, you know, it's really interesting, because I think we're often told that we assume things about people, and I just think, well, neurotypicals do that far more than we do.
It's interesting, actually, because in my book, The New Normal, I talk about, I referenced the work by Remy Yergo in Authoring Autism, and they talk about this thing called demi-rhetoricity, where people make a very big assumption, which is that autistic people, regardless of who they are, and depending on the context, will either be considered too autistic to have an opinion or not autistic enough to have an opinion, and therefore their ability to engage in rhetoric around autism is ignored. So our experience as autistic people is ignored because of what Tanya Adkin likes to call Schrodinger's autism. You know, we're both too autistic and not autistic enough at the same time, and you've never got the Goldilocks autistic who's just right.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and whether that difference between whether you're too autistic or not autistic enough will be decided in the moment, depending on the environment you're in and who's doing the deciding, because it's whatever fits the narrative at the time that's going to silence the disabled person in the room.
Yeah, that's powerful and really fascinating. And actually, you know, a lot of so something I was going to mention, which I find really interesting, and I haven't read your book yet, and I am going to read it, actually, because I'm very rubbish at reading books. I'm typical ADHD. I've got some lovely books sitting on my bedside table, and they look lovely. They're never touched, because it's just too much a bit of a demand, really, to sort of, and having the time. But I think something that I'm quite interested in is there's a lot of new theories and research that come out around autism, and often by advocates that a lot of people find really hard to get on board with and understand. So monotropilism was something, and I've managed to get my head around it now. But for me, those kind of abstract concepts, it's really hard, and they need to be, someone will say to me, what do you mean you don't understand it? And I'll be like, because I just can't, or my brain just doesn't. And I had people talk to me about certain things that we talk about in the autistic community, and especially you guys as advocates, and it's sort of sometimes not always accessible, and I don't know how we change that as a community.
I forget sometimes that not everyone knows what monotropism is and stuff like that, because
see, even said it the wrong way.
Well,
sorry.
There's a bit of an argument between myself and a colleague as to whether it's monotropism or monotropism.
Oh wow, yeah.
But yeah,
so autistic of you.
Like we a lot of people think it's a new theory, but actually I think it was 2012 when the first paper was published. So it's about 10 years old now. And people call it like the closest thing we got to a universal theory of autism. Interestingly, monotropism could also be applied to things like ADHD. There's a wider conversation to be had there about the similarities between ADHD and autistic.
So can you explain it in really simple terms?
So monotropism, however you want to pronounce it. Basically, if you imagine, we know what spoon theory is. You have so many spoons you can spend during the day.
Yeah.
Well, in a sense, we also, as autistic people, have limited attentional resources. Everyone has limited attentional resources. But in autistic people, we find it easier for our minds to take a single track.
Yeah.
And as we enter that sort of hyperfocus, tunnel of hyperfocus, we get what's called inertia. And so it's difficult for us to transition from that track to another track. Yeah. So our minds naturally want to go down a single hyper-focused lane. And that's essentially what monotropism is, as opposed to polytropism, which is what we consider neurotypical people to have, which is where they can sort of split their attention across a few different things at once without it taking too much of a toll on their attentional resources. Whereas in autistic people, when autistic people are forced to split their attention, you can sometimes get what Tanya Radkin calls monotropic split, which if you're in a state of monotropic split for too long, it can lead you straight into a very severe burnout. And that's where you start to get things like spiraling into psychosis and stuff like that.
Yeah, been there. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really interesting because and also people who are not autistic don't understand that there's a physical reaction to being able to focus on something that you enjoy and that is an interest, and it is literally like putting a nice warm blanket on with and a nice pair of comfy slippers, and it is a physical, and it's really fascinating. And I remember watching my daughter once ordering Barbie books by colour, and I said to her, "Oh, why are you doing that?" She goes, "It just makes me feel really nice and calm." And I just like, and it is a physical reaction to that stuff. And I think often some parents maybe don't have that experience, or educators, you know, why are you doing that? Like, it just seems useless or a waste of time, but actually it's actually quite calming. And I think thinking about that sort of I don't say single-mindedness because that sounds negative, but, you know, a great strategy I've learned recently with my child is when she's doing, you know, Roblox on the computer, is instead of saying, right, come down, dinner, is I go and sit next to her and I'll just say, so what are you playing? Tell me what's going on. So then she gets to talk about her interests and is very animated. And then it's like slowly moving her away from that focus, as opposed to ripping the Band-Aid off, which as a parent I did for years and didn't understand why it caused such a strong reaction.
It's the thing with autistic people, especially autistic children, things need to be interest-led. You can't just go, right, we're changing activity now, you've got to do it straight away. You've got to use those intrinsic motivations to slowly transition into the next activity.
Definitely. And I don't think it goes into adults as well. And that's one of the things I find fascinating, is that with adults, that seems to be forgotten about in adults, and it seems to be once you're an adult you don't have those issues. Or, you know, if I'm on my phone and answering an email about something that I've got my ADHD anxiety, if I don't answer it now I'm going to forget it, and then one of the children will say something, I'll go, just give me a minute, and I'm like, calm down, like that's not okay. You know, they're little and they're just, but in my brain, if I don't do this thing because of the trauma of being an ADHD and forgetting everything and being called useless, if I don't do this thing right now, the whole world's going to fall apart. And it's tricky, isn't it, balancing all that stuff?
It's interesting that you mentioned trauma there, because when we're forced to suddenly change tracks, this is where you have to drop the neurotypical understanding of what trauma is. That being forced to suddenly change activity can be traumatic to the autistic mind.
Yeah, definitely. We need to talk more about your book, because I'm someone's having the hardest time in their French class because it's not about my interest. It's really common. My house isn't burning down, but my alarm is going off. That's a wonderful sound. So that's completely ADHD brain, it's gone. No, so yes, I find in school anything I wasn't interested in, not going to happen. Just not going to happen. No matter how hard I try. And I've been in jobs where I have not done the best job because I have to go sort my fire alarm out. Not done the best job because I just wasn't interested. No matter how much I wanted my brain to be interested, it never was.
Yeah, interestingly, my daughter's the same. It's got to be about her interests. So she has a tutor come once a week, and her curriculum with that tutor is catered all around Thailand because that is her interest. So history, geography, maths and English is all catered around Thailand because that's her interest. And if only schools could do that, if schools could do subjects based on a child's interests, I think more children would go to school.
Yeah.
But it's about doing it authentically.
Exactly. I was just saying my daughter's tutor, all the curriculum that he does with her is based around Thailand because that is her interest. So, you know, if they did that at schools, I think more children would want to go, or would be able to access it, should I say.
Definitely. And I think, you know, talking about changing education, David, you've written this book now about the new normal and about, you know, how can we change things? How can the world be made better for autistic people?
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is the concept of autopia, which Academy's been like this lovely little joke about an autistic homeland where all the autistic people are happy. But in the book, I get into the fact that it's a bit more complicated than that, because when you take a group of autistic people and put them into an environment, it's not as simple as, well, we'll give them all the same thing and everyone will be happy because it's what autistic people need. Autistic people are just as varied and diverse as any other group of people. So you're always going to have competing needs.
Absolutely.
So in a sense, you need to individualize things for people, but you also need to look at that shared culture and shared experience between people, the language they share together, because you can account for a lot of the needs through those shared experiences and culture. But you do have to take the time to be more nuanced with the individualized approach, because otherwise what works for one won't necessarily work for another. And you have to be able to account for those variations between people, because we're all different people. You know, autism as a diagnostic criteria talks about a very specific set of experiences, typically the autistic person in distress, in my opinion. But actually, being autistic is so much more than that. Autistic people share a language and a culture. It's an identity. In the same way that, you know, our race could be considered an identity, or our sexuality or our gender could be considered an identity. But you don't assume that all women are the same. So why assume that all autistic people are the same? You've got to consider the person in front of you and be led by their strengths, their motivations, the things they struggle with, and not just go for one size fits all approaches. And I talk about this in the book, where I talk about autopia and the fact you have competing needs, and any attempt at a one-size-fits-all approach is ultimately going to fail.
Definitely. I think the flexibility is really interesting. And I think running an in-person hub is being key. That's been a real learning curve for us, because once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And I think it's really interesting, because I always talk about the Lego thing. So we had a young person came in, we've got 2 big Lego pits full of Lego, and they said, oh, I love Lego. I said, oh, why don't you ever play with it then? I said, there's no instructions. And I was like, okay. And I was like, but I can't follow the instructions. My brain cannot translate the Lego instructions into a 3D kind of thing, a real life thing. And we had this conversation. That was the biggest turning point for me when we first opened the hub. And I was like, wow, their experience is so different to mine, and they literally could not. I mean, we've had people that can't access a group because the activities aren't structured. So now we have a bit of everything in there. But, you know, for me, the structure and the demand of coming in and having to do something that someone wants me to do is like hell on earth. But actually, for some autistic people, they need that. So it's really fascinating. And I think, you know, we always encourage people to sort of have those conversations and dialogues with us, but it's fascinating. And to hear someone who's actually written about that and, you know, has talked about that as an actual thing that is, you know, and maybe that's where everything, as you say, that, I mean, I guess that's the theory of the book, isn't it? Is that everything is, if that stuff isn't dealt with, then it's going to fail on all levels: education, healthcare, jobs, work. Yeah, because that's the thing, work is the same, isn't it?
I mean, fundamentally, what the book looks at is the fact that society is bound in neuronormativity, this idea that there is that one acceptable way of existing and expressing that existence. And the book takes like a critical approach to that neuronormative attitude and considers, where has it come from, how is it harming us, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, and it is harmful. So what is for you personally in the book, do most authors have like a favorite bit, a bit of the book that they think, when you've written it, you think, wow, that's completely, I've nailed it, you know? Is there a bit
it's the stuff about depathologizing mental health, because there is a great deal of stigma attached to mental health, and it's different to the stigma attached to being autistic, because with autistic experience, there are autistic people who are well established saying, we're not broken, we don't need medicalizing. With mental health, society's done a fantastic job of telling people they're mentally ill, they need medication, they need therapy. Now, I'm not saying people don't need medication. It can be important. As I said before, someone who is diagnosed as ADHD can use medication to help them. But I don't believe we have to view everything as a pathology. I don't believe we have to view everything as an illness, because illness is something that can be measured, quantified within the body. There is no test that can diagnose mental illness. What I believe we are looking at, and what a lot of the people I work with believe, is that the things we call mental illness are actually acquired neurodivergence. So usually you take a person, traumatize them in just the right way, and their brain will change the way it functions, and that will manifest as what has historically been called mental illness. And I talk about the fact that actually we need to depathologize mental health and bring it, you know, welcome our neurodivergent neurokin into the fold, because they deserve to have a positive sense of identity and community just as much as autistic and ADHD people do.
Absolutely. I think that's really powerful, actually. Yeah, so you've given me a lot to think about now. I'm just processing it all, but I think yeah, Carly, have you got anything to say on it? Because that's properly thrown me now, and I've just got so much to. I think the medication thing is really interesting, and I think for me, ADHD medication was a big game changer for me. But is it citalopram? I can't even pronounce it properly. That was quite dangerous when I was on that. So it just goes to show, doesn't it? And it's about, but at the same time, as you were saying, it's a trauma thing, isn't it? And it changes you. And I said to someone the other day who'd had a really bad burnout, I said, you're never the same after burnout. I don't know if you agree with that. I don't think, if you've had a really bad burnout, I don't think you're ever the same.
I think we change. I mean, everyone changes over time. It's the nature of who we are. But when you go through something like a severe burnout, you can't come out of that and be the same person you were before, because what you've been through is in itself a traumatic experience. Burnout is not a pleasant experience, and it will change you. But hopefully the things you learn by recovering from burnout will help you prepare in a way that might reduce the intensity or perhaps even stop the next burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Carly, I said to say something and then I just started talking again.
I mean, in the spirit of neurodivergence, I can't remember what I was going to say now.
Oh wow, it's getting late as well. It's like 9 o'clock.
No, that's cool. I was just while you were talking about you know, burnout and stuff, I was thinking about, which I don't know if I've said to you before as well, you know, the whole functioning labels and the levels of autism supposedly people have. No 2 day looks the same. So how can you put us into a box? Because on a Monday, I could be regulated. I could have slept well. I could be feeling great. On a Tuesday, I could be dysregulated, exhausted. And it just, if you have those days, the days that you are eventually going to burn out. So that's where the danger of categorizing us is that no day looks the same, because it's environmental. Because one day it can be, you can be really, you know, calm, collective, okay. The next day there could be lots of stuff going on, and you're burnt, you're out of spoons, and, you know, environmental. So I think it's really dangerous to categorize us into little boxes, because eventually we are going to try and fit into that box that they expect us to be in. And then we're going to burn out because we've spent so much time trying to be in that bracket that people think we are. And then it gets to a point where we're completely burnt out because we're masking too much, you know?
You talk in the book about why functioning labels and subtypes are fallacious, because fundamentally, functioning labels and subtypes, they serve no purpose for autistic people. Being autistic, in disability terms, it's a dynamic disability. The way you're disabled changes and shifts from day to day, week to week, hour to hour. But the reason why those labels exist isn't to help us. It's because it's a neat way of categorizing. You know, if you're high functioning, you're likely to produce profit and pay taxes. If you're low functioning, you're going to cost the system something. You know, it's not actually a way, it's the same as level 1, 2, and 3. It's categorizing you according to your economic value, but people don't like to admit that. Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more. And that's why, you know, we're very much against, you know, the functioning labels at Koala. And again, it's about gently educating, right? And I think that's the thing, is someone will come in and say, my child's low functioning. I'll be like, what does that even mean? Like, I don't understand. Why do you think? Well, then, you know, they're non-speaking, and I think what I found really fascinating was when our son was diagnosed recently, the psychologist said, well, even though they're speaking, they would be considered moderate to severely autistic. And I was just like, what? And I mean, their support needs are definitely I'd say they don't mask as much. Right, so we all have the same things that we struggle with, but because they don't mask as much, they are considered more severe. And I just think, well, it's just bizarre, isn't it? Because intrinsically we're all struggling with at different levels of different things, but yeah, it's all, I want to say a swear word.
People use our ability to mask as a measure of our functioning, and that doesn't work either, because actually masking sometimes can look like leaning into your autistic traits. Masking is putting out whatever you think is expected of you. It doesn't mean you're trying to make yourself appear more neurotypical.
You're trying to say safe, aren't you? A lot of the time, it's like a safety net.
You know, if in the situation you think being really autistic so people will leave me alone is going to keep you safe, that is what you do. Because masking isn't a choice. We don't go, today I'm going to put on the mask, today I'm going to take it off. It's an intrinsic part of us that has been conditioned into us through traumatic experiences of feeling unsafe in our environment. So when we talk about masking, we're not actually talking about the ability to appear more neurotypical, because a person can mask by appearing less neurotypical if they think that's what's going to keep them safe.
Absolutely. And I think Becky just said about burnouts, you know, and how she's saying about how it changes you as well. But I think that it's just frustrating. And I'm sure writing the book must have been a case of, because I guess you're thinking about everything in that book, and you're having to analyze and process all these things as well, that as you write them. And it's difficult not to sometimes look at it and just go, is this ever going to change? Like, are people ever going to see things how we see it? And I do see little changes in our local community, and within Hampshire, we're really lucky people listening to us, but I don't know, it's hard, isn't it? It's a really uphill battle.
Lucky enough that I've been involved in work that says to me there is big change on the horizon, but what I can't tell is how far away that horizon is at the moment.
Yeah,
I don't know if the fundamental changes that will make the lives better will happen in my lifetime. But for me, the ultimate goal is, well, I've got two goals. When I started this, I wanted to be the person I needed 10 years ago. But now that I've got a 6-week-old son, I guess my real goal is I want the world to be a little kinder to him than it was to me.
Yeah, congratulations. I didn't realize he was that young. That's
Yeah, 6 weeks.
and you're still up at 9 o'clock. I'm impressed. It's and that's people like yourselves writing books like you have, that hopefully will change that. And there is yeah, you're right, there is a change. And so I've seen it even in the last year, just locally. People, if you're saying the same thing and you're consistent and you know what you're talking about, people do start to think, well, actually, and it's that whole God, they are actually making a difference here. So people are actually coming out of their service or whatever you're offering, like your mentorship, and they're actually they're functioning better, and they've seen the mental health seems better, and that seems to be the measure, doesn't it? And just quickly going back to the whole burnout thing, do you know anyone who has been diagnosed autistic who wasn't in burnout when it happened? Carly, do you know?
Every autistic person I know was experiencing some level of distress when they were diagnosed.
I know someone who tried to get diagnosed and was told that they weren't struggling enough, and they were like, but I'm not in burnout. And I was like, so but that's the whole argument, isn't it, about the medical model, is that it's autistics in distress.
I think for me it was very much going through looking at the traits for my girls, and it was a bit like, okay, that's me. And I just went to the GP. I was really lucky. I don't know how I managed to wangle this, but I went to the GP in the April and said, I think I'm autistic. I was assessed by the June and I was diagnosed by the July. So I was incredibly lucky. I wouldn't say I was in burnout stage, but I would say that I was at the point where the mental health was detrimental to my well-being, and I was pumping the sertraline, and I wasn't in a good place. They were giving me sertraline, they were giving me amitriptyline, they were, all those kind of things. And yeah, I'll say it for the rest of my life, that it changed my life, because it gave me that sense of understanding of why I am like I am, and not, they were just very much like, oh, you're depressed, oh, you're anxious, oh, here's some medication, here's this, here's that. And everything just made sense in that moment. And I know it sounds very cliche, but it saved my life mentally, because it just gave me that clarification of, actually, this is why I was like I was when I was a child. This is why I was in my 20s.
And that you're okay. You're not a bad person.
Exactly. And lots of people say that I've changed as a person since being diagnosed. I'm not so like, I don't know. I would say that I'm definitely more, I own it. I'm a bit like, okay, before I'd worry about what people thought, but now I'm just like, I'm me. If you don't like me, that's fine, because other people will. So it gave me like that empowerment almost. So
definitely. And that's why, but it is a being assessed is a privilege still, isn't it, in so many areas, unfortunately.
I guess really for a final note on my book, leading on from that, is that fundamentally the reason I wrote it was because being diagnosed autistic saved my life, because I found the autistic community. And okay, the prologue of the book is titled A Love Letter to the Autistic Community, but as someone quite aptly said in a book review of my book, the whole book is a love letter, because the autistic community, I wouldn't have been here to write that book if I hadn't have had the support of the community. And fundamentally, that book exists because they saved me.
Yeah, definitely. And I can relate to that. And I bet there's lots of people that are watching that can relate to that as well. So we have, I've put a link to the book, but I will also, so for those of you that come to the hub, I'll be ordering a copy this weekend so that we have it there as well. And so it is very new out, isn't it? When was it?
It came out on the 2nd of November.
Oh, wow. So it's super new. And we'll just keep spreading the word on it. I think it's a brilliant concept to look at everything. I think is just, yeah, I'm actually going to read it, and I'm going to email you and tell you I've read it. It's going to actually happen.
So, I have already actually, there is a second book out there, but it's a poetry collection, which is along the same themes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's called Existence. And that's out there. That came out around about the same time by chance.
Is that Is it just for adults, or could you use it for older teens?
You could probably use it for older teens, but it's definitely, some of the themes in the poetry are quite mature.
Yeah.
And I've actually submitted a manuscript to a publisher for a book specifically about autism and addiction.
Wow. Okay,
So
that would be.
I
Wow,
will
that's
have more news
exciting.
on that next year, and hopefully I can share with people when I find out if it's
Yeah.
going to be published.
Well, we'd love to have you. I'm sure it will, and I'd love to have you back to talk about that, because like that is something that we can see in the comments has definitely been it's definitely a thing for our community, isn't it? And yeah, the wider community as well. So
In the meantime, anyone who wants to learn more about my experience with addiction and psychosis, my website emergentdivergence.com, and I'll pop it in the chat for you so that you can share it with people.
Well, what I'll do is I'll do a post tomorrow, a link to the live, because obviously we'll keep it on the page, and I'll just make sure we've got all of your, there you go, make sure we've got all of your information in there, because I'm sure that lots of people, and like we say, everyone's got different experiences, and it's really important that people get to hear different autistic people's experience, for sure. So thank you so much for spending your time with us. We've put the world to rights. No, it's been amazing. Thank you, Carly, as well. And yeah, we'll put some more information on the Facebook page so people can order the book. But good luck with it, and let us know how you get on with the manuscript. Hopefully, it will come out next year. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
The long goodbye. Who knows if we're still live?
It says we're still live up in the top of the corner.
I think I've got to actually just close the meeting, haven't I? So bye. I'm actually going now.
Yeah, bye.